Welcome to Inside West Point, Ideas that Impact. I'm Brigadier General Shane Reeves, the Dean of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Through a series of discussions, we will show you a different side of West Point, where we will make even our most complex initiatives accessible to broad audiences, and give you an inside view to our cross-disciplinary work, which is being applied throughout the world. Welcome back. Today I'm thrilled to have Colonel John Gregory, who serves as the Deputy Head of the West Point Department of English and World Languages. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Happy to be here.
Glad to have you. Okay, so let's kick off with just a few points from your extensive bio. Colonel John Gregory is the Deputy Head of the Department of English and World Languages at the United States Military Academy, West Point. Previously, he was the Chinese Program Director at West Point in the Department of Foreign Languages. He holds a PhD in Chinese history from Georgetown University, a Juris Doctorate from the University of Florida, and a Bachelor of Science in Chinese and French from West Point. He was also a Fulbright Fellow at Academia Sinica's Institute of History and Philology in Taiwan during 2013 to 14. His recent work focuses on the discursive analysis of the legal, social, and political rhetoric of the People's Republic of China. John, philology, is that even a real thing? And did I say it correctly?
No, first you did say it correctly, and a philologist would be very proud of your pronunciation. And it is a real thing. It's a discipline that really was much more sort of talked about in the United States, probably in the 1920s or 1930s. And it's still much more common in Europe. Philology essentially is a discipline that thought to understand texts in their historical interpretation, kind of the breadth and depth in time. And then from that, is sort of more modern incarnations of philology, and I'm thinking here people like Eric Auerbach, to develop ways, and Hans-Georg Gadamer, thinking of ways to interpret documents and to interpret human language.
The first time I think I ever saw you was not in person. I think it was on a Voice of America interview where you were talking about Gitmo in Mandarin. Is that right?
That's right. And it's always very impressive to me how the Army thinks about our professional and our civil education, and like all the different degrees and whatnot that you mentioned. Those are all opportunities that were provided to me through the Army, even
Amazing.
to being a Fulbright Fellow at the Academy Sinica. And one of the things that the Army did in our professional education courses at the time is you had to do a media encounter, because we were having a lot of media encounters in Iraq, and so the Army determined that our officers should be versed in media encounters. And so we set up our own. So I set up this, I asked Voice of America if they'd be interested in interviewing a lawyer, got the permissions from the Army, the endorsement from the school that I was at, and basically did a broadcast to China about military justice in Iraq. So it was a different time back then with U.S.-China relations.
Let's talk about your Fulbright experience in Taiwan. So tell me about it.
Yeah, it's an incredible experience. The institution itself, the Academy Sinica, is one of these amazing early 20th century institutions when China was determined intellectually to really think about what it meant to be a modern post-imperial state in the modern world. And they built this research institute called the Academy Sinica in Nanjing that was meant to be an intellectual heart or hub for China, like a graduate school without undergraduate students. And they had institutes for all sorts of different, for history, for language. The Institute of History and Philology is one of the original institutes. Some of the most famous Chinese intellectuals of the 20th century were closely associated with this institute. When Chiang Kai-shek lost the Civil War to the communists, the Academy Sinica, a large part of their faculty, research facility, books, literally got on ships and was transferred to Taiwan. And that's the genesis of the modern Academy Sinica in Taiwan today. So the institution was fascinating. By the time that I was there, it was a very respected hub of sinology worldwide. The scholars that you were surrounded with on a daily basis were just, it was a very humbling experience. And to be able to live in Taiwan, which is where obviously there's a lot of talk now, national security and other things related to Taiwan, economy, national security, international relations, et cetera. And to be there among those group of scholars at the time and thinking about things from the perspective of Chinese history, the archives that were brought over from China, the imperial archives, and it was a great experience for my kids too. Kids went to local Taiwanese schools at the time. And really, it's just another one of those opportunities the Army's provided. So.
Do you maintain relationships with those that you met while you were there?
Yes, yeah, yes, we do.
So you mentioned the archives. Was there anything you encountered in the archives that was particularly impactful or important to you?
Yeah, so my PhD, my research field of study was 18th century Chinese law. Legal proceedings that had occurred in the provinces, but the documents were at the central government level during the Qing dynasty in the 18th century, really over about a 110-year period. And when the nationalists lost the Civil War to China, and this has something to do with how documents and the possession of documents relates to legitimacy or perceived legitimacy, the nationalist government, in fleeing with the army, actually took with them a large part of the Qing dynasty archives. So those are archived at the Academy Sinica and as well as other places, and they're incredibly accessible. So Taiwan is really almost counterintuitively a really great place to do research on 18th century Chinese sort of law and government and this sort of thing. What really became clear and sort of led me in a new direction of research was that even though both China and the United States, both historically and in modern times, had distinct languages that applied to law, when you looked at something, you knew that we're talking about law. The relationship of those norms and legitimacy and the a priori assumptions that made those things binding were also very different. And I'd never thought about that as a common law lawyer in the United States because it was just a given that the system was legitimate.
You mentioned that there was access to mainland China also.
Oh, yes.
And so there is complementary archives in mainland China?
Yes, so China has two main archives. One is called the First Historical Archives, the Lishu Danguan in Beijing. That holds primarily Qing Dynasty and Ming Dynasty documents. And when I'm talking documents, I'm talking hundreds of thousands or millions of documents. The Chinese bureaucracy, imperial bureaucracy, if a document was sent from the very provincial level up from the county, through the province, to the central government, when it arrived at the central government, if it was something intended for the emperor, it was copied usually in 3 or 4 or 5 copies. A recording was made somewhere that was received. A summary of that document was made in another book, and these were distributed to various places throughout the government. So a lot of these things are copies of documents, but there's a lot of documents, especially from the Qing era in China. So Chiang Kai-shek and the retreating nationalist government brought over what they could get on ships because they were kind of in a hurry at the time. The first historical archives, the Ming and the Qing archives, those are located in the Forbidden City. You literally walk through the Shihuamen, this big, gigantic, ornate gate. You take a left, you walk through a PLA garrison, basically, with basketball courts, with party slogans on the walls. You continue walking straight, you take a left, and then you're in the first historical archives.
That's fascinating. What's the most impactful research project that you have worked on, and how has it shaped the way you think about U.S.-China relationships in the modern era?
I was very fortunate to have an opportunity while working here to participate in a well-funded research project to study what the Chinese were calling, or are calling, socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. And if you go back to the period of 2012, 2013, 2014, there was a lot of talk coming out of China about the development of an oath to the Chinese Constitution, about new legislative structures, about different types of essentially equivalents of the Administrative Procedures Act and other things. And these things were supposed to be leading, what some US scholars thought at the time was that these things were indications that China was heading more in what we would think of as a rule of law kind of direction. And so as the talk and funding for beautiful new courtrooms, for new legal publications, for new law schools and libraries, as those things were starting to increase significantly under this program of socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics, the United States was curious and there was funding to go and kind of actually explore this. And so with that opportunity, I was able to, and so I was really looking for, my initial question was, what impact over time could this have on China developing what we think of as rule of law, the good faith interpretation of transparently published and legitimately enacted norms. So I got to go to China probably under that particular grant. I probably went 15 times. I was able to sit in on actual live court proceedings in different provinces, was able to buy hundreds of books and publications, was able to interview and talk with some of the most famous legal scholars in China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. It was impactful on me because it kind of changed the direction of my intellectual life. And I wasn't expecting that. And I think this is one of the things that really lets you know that a research project is worthwhile. Because I was looking in the process of looking for why basically socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics could be a legitimate sort of path or entryway into a rule of law, has to do with questions of legitimacy. And I realized in that process, because they had the language, they had the courtroom, they even had young, energetic, thoughtful, smart judges that I was kind of hanging out with and talking to. But at the end of the day, I couldn't separate in my mind a party command by fiat and its ultimate matriculation into what legal language, right?
Let me interject. So that sounds like you went with at least a reserved hope that they were moving towards an actual rule of law based order, and you came away with a bit more of a cynical view, which is, I mean, from what I'm hearing you say, which is this is all a smokescreen for the party.
When I went into it, I was kind of neutral on it. But a lot of people, a lot of American legal scholars who think about China, and remember this was the age too of really significant, and I would say even kind of a enthusiastic attitude about trade with China and exchanges and other things. So there's a lot of background that's operating at that time. But I think there was a general sort of zeitgeist in America that maybe this is kind of China's on the right track. Talking to Chinese friends at the time and scholars, people were kind of cynical about the future of autocracy and this sort of thing. So most legal systems, China did, the party, the Communist Party, did want the legal system to be legitimate and accepted by the people. Most matters handled by any legal system are actually routine matters. So for instance, I would go to a trial on, I remember there was one guy, Mr. Jew, and he stolen a bunch of iPhones. Like his MO was he had a shoe store in the mall, and if you'd leave your iPhone there, Mr. Jew would slip it into his backpack, right? And he'd been caught like 6 times. And so by the time I'm observing this trial, and it wasn't a show trial, it was literally a random trial because I had this kind of access to the docket and everything. And now I think it's a lot less open even on that. But at that time it was, depending, I don't want to overstate the case, but you could walk into the courtroom sometimes. I'd been through many American trials. I thought that the judge handled it, thoughtfully, that he gave the accused the opportunity to be heard, that the accused was well on notice about the charges, and the punishment was not at all sort of disproportional, what one might expect, and took into account certain matters of aggravation and mitigation. By all accounts, right, that is, the place where most Chinese might be expected to encounter the legal system. The challenge is that structurally, though, China has what's called a 政法委员会, a political legal committee. And the political legal committee essentially sits in every court. And it's not a off-the-books sort of illegitimate organization. It's a fundamental part of the structure. And it's where the party guidance comes to bear with individual cases. Right? So a structural part of the Chinese court system is that the judge should know what the guidance of the party should be in a particular category of cases, or in particular cases, what might be politically sensitive. The chief judge should know, and they should make sure that those matters never go forward without them having been really, in a sense, pre-decided or deliberated on by the political legal committee. So at the end of the day, the idea of judicial independence, which had been sort of among Chinese scholars something that had been talked about positively maybe prior to the early 2000s, became verboten in Chinese legal discourse, open Chinese discourse. And it was replaced by a term which was called, in the party discourse, court trial independence. So 司法独立, judicial independence, became 审判独立. And the idea being that there's no improper, what they would say, influence on the proceedings. But the party telling the judge how to decide a case, that's proper, right? And so thinking about then what makes the law legitimate or any different from a party command, and that led me down a vast intellectual journey.
So you can just tell from this conversation that you have got a very rich understanding of Chinese culture, Chinese law. You have been there multiple times. I say this oftentimes about you, that you're a great strategic asset for the Army and the Academy because of your insights. How do you take all of what you just mentioned and how that's informed you intellectually and put that into the cadets? And what are some of the best stories you've seen that you can tell us about the cadet experience in relation to the Chinese program here at West Point?
Yeah, well, in one sense, it's really caused me to deeply appreciate the potential that exists in the structures that we have in the United States. You know, the country is formed at the end of the Enlightenment period. It's based in reason. We have robust, structures of free speech, and and ideas of due process and rule of law. And in fact, as military officers, our constitutional commitment is to these things, right? And so the experience with China and thinking about, so what makes law legitimate, in the United States, right? And how does that relate to these other things? So I think in the Army especially, we've got General Schofield, and he talks about, the discipline which makes the soldiers of a free country, which is something we all had to memorize. That there's a corresponding spirit in the breast of the commander that makes the soldiers of a free country reliable in battle. And I think that corresponding spirit is one of mutual self-respect, that even though, this might be superior, this might be a subordinate, at ground root, we're all politically equal. And so at West Point, one thing that I find, because we're in a language department, and in language, we have English, we have 8 world languages. And so we have the opportunity every day, and this is, what's so exciting really about the core curriculum, primarily where we touch all the cadets, but also about the majors. We have 4 courses in the core curriculum. We can engage with the cadets and model and help cultivate the best habits of dealing with human language that are most efficacious in a system like this, where we have the ability to dialogue with each other intersubjectively and to reach new understandings. And I think if you can do that, it's not always possible when you're out in your unit, you're working with your platoon or something like that. You don't have time to explain and have a long dialogue with a private about kind of what's going on here with helicopter maintenance maybe. But if you have that disposition and ability to articulate it, and those opportunities you'll have a tendency to do that. And then your soldiers will trust you more when you don't have time to explain things, because they'll understand your thought process, your reasoning. They'll know that you have the disposition to try to get the best information, that your ends, whatever they are good. And this all has to do with how we use and think about language.
It's about trust.
It's exactly trust. That is what it is. So our sensitivity to language, our ability to interpret, to construct meaning, those things are core to the kind of trust required of free societies.
And when the cadets are studying Chinese culture, or you've taken them on trips, are they surprised by the differences in regards to the ability to have open discourse or to talk, about what you would like?
So a lot of times, if you talk to someone in Beijing who's only interested in, say, kind of doing a new TikTok dance, right? Or, kind of going to their favorite restaurant, that person probably wouldn't feel that they're not free. Just the same as in America, someone who, if you're not trying to do something, you don't feel yourself up against the restraints of it. I think the interesting thing about our cadets is that they're very curious, and they want to engage in deeper conversations, and they want to understand differences. And so a lot of times their frustration initially when we would go to China or to Taiwan. Taiwan's also very much a constitutionally open society, unlike China. You have to be at a certain level of language to even get there to begin with. And it was always one of the most exciting things when cadets began to, through their very hard work and commitment, get to the point and be at the intellectual place where they could actually, it would dawn on them how powerful that difference is in a society like ours. To be able to be a free person, to be able to engage in open dialogue, and how much we take that for granted.
How do those cultural differences make our militaries different? And what are the practical implications of those differences?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a heuristic device. If you think about a Chinese parade, right? So-called People's Liberation Army parade, you'll see that they're goose-stepping, right? There's a premium placed on sort of this automaton type obeying of superiors. This has to do everything, I think, with the conception of the citizen. If you think about the way West Point cadets parade, we march like we walk. I think historically we've called it a soft shoe march. But we feel that we can walk together with such precision that we don't lose our individual selves. We're still individual citizens, but we can do things in a highly coordinated way, the left wheel, the right wheel, eyes right, these sorts of things, that demonstrate that free and equal citizens operating within a voluntary hierarchy under open norms can accomplish great and amazing things. And it's one reason why West Point, has this significant responsibility to do the type of ritual that we do and to do it right, because we're in some ways this is where it affects the whole officer corps, right, and the culture of the officer corps. So in China, like the conversations that I might have with a cadet about any incident of American history, people are very familiar with, say, My Lai, right? We can talk about those things openly, honestly, critically, and dialogically with cadets. And whatever they could bring to the table, whatever source, if that source was reliable, the legitimacy of our Army and our command can stand up to that because it's grounded in things that we accept as citizens and that recognize our equality. In China, you can't do that. So for the American Army, I think that because the fairly new course, the Army of the Republic, we understand the Army is grounded within the Republic. We understand ourselves as free citizens who are voluntarily operating here, and we can talk about that and make sense about that in an open way, when we're willing and committed to doing that. And I think that gives us a tremendous advantage, both to better understand situations we're in, to react to things for the platoon leader on the ground level, to understand the idea of commander's intent that would be nearly impossible, the level of mission command that we expect from our lieutenants to operate, I think, in the Chinese Army. And I think all these things are related.
What's the counter argument to having the critical thinking skills at the lowest level?
Yeah.
And I would give my own disclaimer, which is obviously I'm a proponent of teaching our youngest officers to be critical thinkers. I think it gives us an asymmetric advantage, but there's got to be a reason why these autocratic states emphasize the opposite.
Well, for one thing, if you looked at China in let's say late 90s, early 2000s, many people in China, and I'm talking across Chinese society, intellectual, different social classes, felt that China was evolving, and many people inside and outside of China thought that it was evolving towards a more sort of liberal democratic model, and one that was actually part and parcel of being a modern country. There were all kinds of books written about a burgeoning Chinese civil society, and even all of us who studied China at the time actually, at some level or another, bought into that. One thing that happened, right, if you think about Xi Jinping's coming to power, you're talking the 2012, 2013 timeframe. A lot of people thought it as a reversal. They thought China was heading in one direction. There had been term limits that had been put in place on the Politburo, for instance, that were considered very significant. Age limits. There was a acceptance of an idea. It became common wisdom, so to speak, that it was more of a cooperative sort of body than sort of one strongman leader, that they had moved out of the shadows of kind of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, who most of their power came from sort of informalistic, personalistic kind of charisma position and relationships, and that they were moving more toward an institutionalized model. The challenge with that kind of way of thinking, looking back on it now, although I wasn't critical of that view then, is that it didn't recognize, and now I think it's much clearer, that the Communist Party, in order to survive itself, can't be ultimately institutional. Because to be institutional in the true institutional sense, you have to have something that undergirds your understanding of yourself, your norms, that is other than you just said it, right? Something that people have a place that they can buy into as actually being true, right? How this relates to the Army, I think, is very critical, because the assumptions in the Army that you're a general, I'm a colonel, that we both buy into this system because we think it's legitimate, that you're going to give me broad guidance, and then I'm going to, with the department merger, let's think about that. The departments of English and philosophy merged with the law department, and then what had been the foreign languages department. The guidance in a very much mission command style was a very broad kind of guidance. Here's what I'm looking for, here's what I'm looking to do. And then you trust your subordinate leaders to think about how they're going to carry that out in good faith. That assumption that could even happen without clear, prescriptive commands on how to do something is so foreign to Chinese military thinking that it just isn't in the cards.
So, in what ways does China's history, and maybe when I say history, I'm talking about more of a recent snapshot, and I guess their discourse influence its military strategy? As you were talking, I'm thinking about how does this influence what they see as possible and what they want to do?
So there are some, history always has an effect, right? So, the narrative that one has of history, right? Those can often be tied to sort of political legitimacy and these sorts of things, right? So the Communist Party comes to power in 1949. And Marxism has a very particular way of thinking about history. Marxist material dialectic, right? With this dialectic of the forces of production and means of production interacting with all of society over time kind of leads to this, and then boom, you have the Communist Party of China, right? It's teleological. In fact, I remember skimming a book in a Chinese bookstore once, and it's, why did history choose the Communist Party? And for us, we might use it as a metaphor. Why did history choose, General Reeves to be Dean of West Point? But you wouldn't have a history chose me because of the forces of history and how it operates over time. And so General Reeves will be the Dean of West Point because it has to be this way at this time. Marxism has a space for that kind of thinking, that so the party has this historical mission. And you combine that with the events of the, say, 18th, 19th, and 20th century narratives of sort of lost imperial glory.
Century of humiliation.
The Binding Guochi, of course, there's some fact to that, right? But then what it means for how you think about yourself in the present, that's probably what's more important from their military thinking. Now they really frame themselves heavily as kind of the protectors of the race, and they use the term race, the culture, the fatherland, and those kind of terms have become very prominent, especially as they've moved more ideologically away from what we might think of, a priori assumptions that might be more familiar to Marx, but still operating within sort of Marxist dialectical terms in their discourses, and then moving more towards basing their legitimacy on ethnocentrism.
When China joined the WTO, say in 2001, I believe, and some of the opening, it seemed, of China, both economically or culturally, and even things where you had the ability to travel freely, and all that seems to be going in a different direction. And we are now more open about an era of competition. Do you see common ground between the way the Chinese Communist Party operates and the way the United States operates, or do you think that this competition will just continue to accelerate?
So I don't think that any trend is ever sort of set and then it continues on that way. And I think we can't use history as a model because it's in the past and things are always changing. But I think that one of the common themes of history is that anytime something seems like it's certainly heading in another direction, it's about to turn in another direction. So I don't think we can know, right? But I do think that there are many people in China who are very worldly. They think about their own country, China, and they look for models elsewhere. And I think that our potential to influence China is probably at its best when we're presenting something that's very different from what the CCP is doing. So the CCP, for instance, is very good about choreographed news. In fact, there was a thing about Chinese avatar, using an avatar for the news, like a virtual news broadcaster. But I looked at the two, and it didn't seem very different from the regular news broadcast. If you're already at that point, you're not going to be impressed with AI coming out of the United States that's kind of a mimicry of human beings, because China will figure that out, and people will be exposed to that, and there'll be efficiency things and everything else. What is really impressive, I think, to Chinese, and it's at times when there's been movements. I mean, you think about the Tiananmen movement, right? That was a nationwide movement that just wasn't in Beijing. Is when they see the possibility that people can both be free and accomplish great things together. They don't need kind of a Leviathan controlling them. And how do you go about doing that in a very pluralistic and diverse society? And so to the extent that we're modeling for the world, which is really some of our constitutionalism, rule of law, and those things they're not hearing about them just on a Voice of America broadcast, but they're hearing about them from their uncle who lives in the United States, right? There's tremendous context between these two countries and tremendous avenues, right, for communication. That's very convincing. We've called that soft power in the past, but I don't even know that we need to think about it that way.
It makes me think about how we're both sometimes naive, but also hopeful. Naive in the sense of, I remember very clearly a conversation about that China would move further towards the West when the access to the internet proliferated, and we were completely wrong.
Yeah.
We didn't know how far they would go to control that. We didn't think it was possible, and they found it not only a way to control it, but to be able to use it in such a way to gain further control. On the other hand, when I think about what you just stated about the Chinese Communist Party comes to power in 1949. That's not very long ago, and they have an extremely rich history of other versions of government, which means that the people are maybe have potential to think in different ways.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, or do you disagree?
I think that that's true. I think that there's a tremendous cultural repertoire, and there are quite a few thinkers in China and Taiwan. And these folks are not, what you'd think of like dissidents, or they're not out there, but they think very hard about how China's traditions, in particular Confucianism, could be compatible with liberal democratic constitutionalism, and even how it could bolster what they see as some defects in constitutionalism as it's been practiced in the West. Not in a pretextual way to for party power, but because it really could actually help address some of those challenges.
Why is this competition seemingly increasing across the spectrum between the United States, or maybe you just call it the West, and China?
It's hard to know, and there's so many factors that I don't think any one thing explains it. Social policies, social actions, it seems that their full effects, or many of their effects, aren't felt until maybe 10 or 20 years into the future. When I was in flight school, we learned about something called gyroscopic precession, that any control input given to a swash plate that would shift the pitch on the rotor blades would only take effect 90 degrees after it went in. And apparently Igor Sikorsky, who's like a genius of helicopters, he couldn't figure out why this was. And they told us, I'm not a physicist, right, but they told us that there's no explanation for that. So he just moved all the controls 90 degrees. And so it accounted for it, right? So I think that there's sort of a geoscopic precession effect with things that we do. The fact that labor was so cheap in China in 1979, right, as we first started to think of 1982 Chrysler Jeep and all this Beijing Jeep, and Iacocca. That had everything to do with the fact that the very commercialized, industrious Chinese people had been so ground down with ideological turmoil and class struggle that well-educated and hardworking people were willing to work for dirt for foreigners in foreign factories without the protection of labor unions, basically for what they could get, and felt grateful to have it. So you had entire migrations in China throughout, especially accelerating into the 1990s, that of people leaving villages, both parents leaving their one child with a grandparent and going into a village, going to a factory, say in Shenzhen, and working in penury type conditions. And so that there's a great incentive there, right, for, international corporations and others to be able to take advantage of that with the hope of the market. If you're facing things like labor unions and other things in your own country, it becomes very attractive, I think, to take advantage of a communist party that prohibits labor unions and allows you to do those things, as well as a population that's been so beat down and very optimistic and hopeful about the future. What's happened, I think, in some respects, is that the Chinese have worked so hard, right? And I'm not a big believer in it either. It's all been through stolen IT, and there's certainly a lot of stolen IT. There's no doubt about it. But if you saw how hard and how much the Chinese people have sacrificed, and the Communist Party takes all the credit for this, although the Communist Party created the conditions that kind of set this up in a negative way, right? You'd kind of get a sense of now people are kind of entering the middle class in large numbers. By some estimates, China has a larger middle class than the entire US population. If you travel to Tianjin or in the suburbs of Chengdu, even out in the West, you could easily believe that. And so some of those things that made it unequivocally beneficial for some in the United States to move factories, which I was all for when I was a cadet. I wrote a letter to President Clinton explaining that if China, the yearling, right?
I'm sure it was super impactful.
Oh no, it was super impactful. He followed my advice, right? Yeah. I said that if we just gave China permanent MFN status, most favored nation status, then it would solve all our problems. Everything would be solved through trade, and people would be, kind of happy, and everyone would be wealthy and everything like that, right? So at the same time that China's become, the population, the demographics crisis that's well known, the labor shortages, and people aren't as willing to work for such terrible wages, At the same time that's happening, potentially, and I don't know this because I'm not an economist or a sociologist, but potentially some of the consequences of the American side of some of the manufacturing moving over there 30 years ago or 90 degrees input beforehand is now coming to bear in our country, in our discourses. And so one of the things about legitimacy, I think, is that trust that the policies and the grand policies, the coordinating functions of government, in the long run are going to broadly benefit the population, the electorate. In that context, it's almost natural that competition arises. There's not as much advantage for us dealing with China anymore. China doesn't anticipate the high levels of foreign direct investment that they had for many years, and maybe they need it, but they maybe don't think they need it as badly. And we saw that manifested even in some different programs that I was involved with, where before the Chinese were very accommodating. They wanted expertise to be there, the managers to come from either Taiwan or from the United States. And now they would be much more ambivalent or even antagonistic to it.
If you had to illustrate or give an example of competition between the United States and China, which one comes to your mind? And then a follow-on to that is, what part of the competition concerns you the most?
Yeah, so there's so many areas of competition, right? The area of competition that I think has been in the news a lot over the last 8 years has been in IT and networking, apparatuses, gear, infrastructure, right? With Huawei, obviously, and that's become a competition between us and China, but it's manifested across different allies because generally speaking, the Chinese products have been considered reliable and cheap. And so the questions then of, to what extent those create a risk of a penetration into infrastructure, right? And the communications infrastructure and the IT information infrastructure. That's one area that I think is very common. I don't think about that area a lot because I think ultimately, to me, it kind of makes sense that we would protect our communications infrastructure, and I think there could be challenges with that. One of the areas that I think, and it comes out of the competition, but it's in a very ambiguous kind of way, is the whole brouhaha over TikTok, right? Because TikTok its parent company is Douyin in China, and it is a ByteDance in China. And it's a massively popular domestic platform here in the United States. So you have a tech platform that involves tremendous amounts of US user location, information. You have the ability to move information very quickly across borders, whatever the guarantees might be. You not only don't have any guarantees of information security in China, but you actually have laws that require Chinese companies to share. And if you think FISA court is a thin due process or whatever, this is the exact opposite. This is an affirmative. You will share the information, right? And so that's the kind of thing that I think in the United States we need to be able to talk intelligently and thoughtfully about. But too often, TikTok becomes a kind of polemic data point that's used for whatever thing the person's advocating for, right? And so I think that this worries me because it's illustrative of, I think, more significant, and these trends have probably always been there, but I think we're at best when we minimize them, which is that whatever topic we're talking about, to try to separate out what I want to be true, what helps my side from the actual topic we're talking about, and to be honest about those things, right? So if what you're concerned about is information security, then think about it in terms of information security. If what you're concerned about is that TikTok is bad for teenagers, then, and information security really isn't your thing, then say that that's what you're concerned about and argue about that, right? And I think being able to have those, and it's like.
But you might be, what you're saying is that might be just capturing a more general concern or distrust, and you're using this particular topic.
This goes to the academic program goal of reasoned argumentation. What we often do with language, and this is very common, it's probably not ever completely avoidable, is we engage in rhetoric where we start out with this point we want to be true. We don't want TikTok. And then we kind of marshal any point we think might help us, right? And we even exaggerate it and polemicize it. And then if something comes back at us that's not supporting where we ultimately want to go, we minimize that even if we actually would otherwise think it's a good point. Right. And for military officers, I think it's absolutely essential that they be able to be self-aware, because most of us don't even realize we're doing this, because like we'll use the term advocacy a lot at West Point or anywhere, right? Advocacy is a very popular term, probably less popular at West Point than it is other schools who advocate for the humanities, advocate for this, advocate for that. But if I advocate to you, I've already know what I want to do. Right. I'm essentially manipulating you into kind of whatever it is I want. So I'm feeding you these are my points that are really strong. And anything you come back with me at, even if it's a good point that I should think about it and respond to it and modify my position, I'm going to rhetorically find a way to dismiss it or minimize it.
Like, it's because when you do that, as you stated, when you're advocating, what you're really thinking about is your response to, you lay out your argument and you're already thinking about how to respond to further, continue to further, versus actually considering each other's thoughts.
That's right.
To move, the collective thought to a better position.
That's exactly right.
Let me ask you this. Can you talk a little bit about China's broader military modernization efforts and how those impact or should impact how we think as a nation, how we should be evolving?
Yeah, so China, the military, so the PLA, the so-called People's Liberation Army, was as much a broad social organization in its conceptualization in China, in the party's kind of mind. So if you go back even 20 years ago, you had large dance troops that were part of the PLA that had been sort of relics of the old 1950s, kind of going into villages and doing propaganda with less literate peasants and this sort of thing. And so the PLA has always been sort of deeply involved with these sort of social things. It's also a huge bureaucracy, and its territorial distribution and arrangement in China really didn't lend itself, at least in the party's mind, to the kind of what they saw as, we use the term revolution in military affairs. I think it was very popular a few years ago, but this kind of idea that first of all, combined operations and joint operations are really the way that a modern military has to operate. So one of the main thrusts, there's been several thrusts in the Chinese modernization going back the last 12 years, and one of them they call informationalization, which really has to do with digitization, and that's kind of a side thing that they're very interested in. But one of the biggest thrusts that's familiar to us has been creating a force that can operate jointly. And so about 10 years ago, they implemented military reforms. One of the most significant parts of it was to establish joint commands and to establish things. Now, these are all in China, right? So these are like our regional combatant commands. But the idea is that you have one overall commander for the first time in China that would command, Army, ground forces, Navy, and Air Force. And you have specific delineated service chiefs, right? And so and really to a large extent, and I haven't read all this doctrine, what I understand, and from the interactions that I've had about this, and I was in a few mill exchanges where this was talked about in China, they largely try to replicate a lot of our doctrine on that. The thing that I think we should be a little cautious about is assuming that they'll fail. And I say this because we know it took a long time to develop joint doctrine, right? We think all the way from 1979 and Urgent Flurry all the way to where we prove that jointness works, and we think of like OIF, right? And the entire Joint Command. So we think, that took about 30 years to actually get from just doctrine to practice to the culture in the military with our joint billets and all these things, right? So I remember a few years ago when China bought the Liaoning Hao from Ukraine, this hunk of an old aircraft carrier, right? And they towed it over to China, and they were going to practice doing landings on it. And people in our military, they scoffed at it, and they said, it's going to take them 30 years to do carrier landings. I don't think it took them 30 years to do carrier landings. And I think what do they have now, 3 or 4 aircraft carriers and others, in the works, right? So this kind of might go back to your point a little bit earlier about why might one want to have this sort of, more sort of direct mass formation, I say it, you make it happen kind of, control. Because you can do very big things. You can move a lot of energy at once that way.
The other thing you can do is make the organization not risk adverse, because you can just force things to happen without questioning or other things. We could keep talking all day long. This has been exceptional, and there's a number of other things that we could go into. But the way I want to end it is with some rapid fire questions. So what are 3 books or resources you'd recommend to someone who's listening who wants to better understand U.S.-China competition?
Yeah, so I think that really depends on where they're at intellectually. There are books I read now that would have made no sense to me 10 or 15 years ago or before I did that research project on law in China. So I think the first thing people have to understand where they're at intellectually and what they're trying to understand about China. If you're thinking about it to understand the long-term U.S.-China military relationship, Barbara Tuchman's Stilwell and the American Experience in China, I thought was a great book. But if you're not into history and you're not looking for that and thinking kind of long term, you might find it less interesting. If you want to understand something about the discourse of China and why they use certain terms since the 1940s, I think it's useful to read things like the Communist Manifesto, right? Not for its sort of truth value, right, but for its, why does this sort of theory incorporated in this kind of language? But if you want to understand kind of what's happening with China discourse-wise in terms of actual power relations, anything by Foucault would probably help you understand that better than anything by Marx.
What is the piece of advice you give to new professors coming into your department to prepare our cadets for being competitive in our future landscape?
Yeah, so number one, don't infantilize the cadets. Talk to them as if they're serious people who are capable of thinking. Model for them how the best possible example of articulating thoughtfully what your positions are or what you're in this sort of dialogical fashion, and do that in the classroom. And when you teach, use your subject that you're teaching to help foster and encourage that.
What's your favorite part about teaching at West Point?
So the personal journey and how much I've learned since I've been at West Point. I feel like I'm learning right now, like even today, at the same rate that I was learning when I was a little child. And that to me is very impressive because I hadn't imagined that before I came to West Point. So constantly reading, constantly being challenged by the cadets, constantly engaging in dialogue with my colleagues, and then seeing when cadets begin to appreciate, and you can see when they appreciate and develop a deeper self-awareness based on something that they've read, something that they've has challenged them. That's tremendously fulfilling to me.
How is West Point perceived by the Chinese?
So there's kind of a mixed question here, right? In this sort of socio-cultural memory of China, right, West Point occupies a very high place of prestige. And the Chinese have a saying, "wen wu shuang quan," right, which means that the ideal of someone being both a scholar and having martial abilities. Probably when people say that, even today in China, even with all the CCP polemics against the United States the last 10 years, probably one of the first three things that pops into people's mind might be some Chinese historical examples, but probably West Point also pops into mind. I've never met anyone in China or even Taiwan in the Chinese-speaking sort of sphere who hasn't heard of and held West Point in very high esteem. I have no doubt that I was a more attractive boyfriend to my wife, who's Taiwanese, because I came from West Point. So
I will tell you that I've had this engagement with cadets multiple times. I've gone on trips with you, and they will tell you stories that you will be around a cab driver and they know about MacArthur or Stilwell.
Right.
So they know a lot about West Point and the history of the U.S. Army's connection to it. What's the best advice you ever received?
So thinking now, because your best advice changes over time depending on the situation, and the advice that I rely on the most now and think about it a lot is that whatever things made you a successful leader at lower echelons and in different organizations, don't assume that those things will also make you a successful or good leader at the next level. You may very well have to unlearn things that were very effective and very important for making effective teams at a lower level. And I think about that a lot.
Great advice. All right, well, thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you.
Truly appreciate it. So be sure to tune in to the Inside West Point Ideas That Impact podcast next month. Remember, you can find this podcast, as well as the other podcasts, journals, and books hosted or published by the West Point Press at westpointpress.com. Until next time.